Joseph Duggar has been released on bond. That's the headline, and on its own, it sounds like just another legal development. But once you look at what happened around that release, and more importantly, who was involved, the situation starts to look very different. Because this isn't just about Joseph Duggar. Kendra Duggar is now in a position where she doesn't even have custody of the children, and yet the conversations coming out of those early jail calls suggest something that doesn't match the seriousness of what's happening. At the same time, Jim Bob Duggar appears to be playing a much bigger role behind the scenes, financially, structurally, and in how quickly everything moved once bond was set. And when you put those pieces together, the release, the family response, and what was actually said in those calls, it raises a much bigger question. What is really going on inside this situation, and why does it feel like the full story hasn't been told yet? Joseph Duggar's release came down to one decision: bond. The total was set at $600,000. $100,000 tied to the first charge and $500,000 tied to the second. For a case described as extremely serious under Florida law, that number alone raises questions. In situations like this, prosecutors often push for no bond at all. That didn't happen here. Instead, prosecutors requested a high bond, pointing out that Joseph wasn't local to the area and that the alleged incident happened while he was out of state. The judge accepted that approach and allowed the possibility of release under specific conditions. Those conditions were relatively limited. Joseph was ordered to have no contact with the minor connected to the case and no unsupervised contact with any other minors under 18. Beyond that, there were no major restrictions like GPS monitoring. And that's where the situation starts to shift. Because once that bond was set, the next step wasn't uncertainty, it was immediate action. Jim Bob Duggar, Joseph's father, appears to have had the financial ability to respond quickly. Recent property sales, including multi-million-dollar transactions involving land and commercial assets, suggest liquidity was already in place. So this wasn't a delay, it wasn't hesitation. It was readiness. And that raises an important question moving forward, not just about how Joseph was released, but how prepared the family was for this moment in the first place. That level of readiness doesn't just happen overnight. When Joseph Duggar's bond was set, the response from the Duggar family, and especially from Jim Bob Duggar, moved quickly and with very little friction. Reports from the hearing indicated that family members were already present and prepared to post bond. That matters. Because posting bond at that level doesn't just require money, it requires access, coordination, and a clear understanding of what's about to happen next. Jim Bob Duggar has long been at the center of the family's financial structure. Over time, he's built a network of businesses, real estate holdings, and income streams that support not just himself, but much of the extended family. In this situation, that structure appears to be functioning exactly as designed. Recent property sales, including multi-million-dollar transactions involving land and warehouse assets, suggest that funds were being converted into cash in advance. Whether that was intentional preparation or broader financial restructuring, the result is the same: the ability to act immediately when Joseph needed it. And once that support is in place, the situation begins to look less like an individual legal case and more like a coordinated family response. At the same time, other members of the Duggar family were stepping in behind the scenes. John Duggar, along with his wife Abby, and Jed Duggar were reportedly working with Kendra. helping manage business responsibilities and decisions while Joseph was in custody. This wasn't just emotional support, it was operational. Which adds another layer to what's happening here. Because while Joseph is the one facing charges, the response involves multiple people, multiple roles, and a system that seems designed to absorb the disruption. And that brings the focus directly to Kendra Duggar and what her situation reveals about what's really happening behind the scenes. Kendra Duggar's situation introduces a very different layer to this story. In the early jail call, when Joseph asks about the children, her response is brief and noticeably distant. She says she's heard they're doing well. He doesn't press further. She doesn't elaborate. And that exchange on its own stands out, because at that point, the children had already been removed from her care. She wasn't with them. She wasn't directly involved in their day-to-day situation. Instead, she was staying with other members of the Duggar family, relying on information being passed to her. That separation is significant. It shifts the focus away from just a legal case and into the immediate consequences affecting the family itself. At the same time, Kendra describes her environment in a way that suggests constant activity behind the scenes. She mentions being with John Duggar and Abby, along with Jed Duggar, working through business-related decisions and trying to organize next steps. There's a sense of coordination. There's a sense that multiple people are stepping in to stabilize things while Joseph is absent. But what stands out most isn't just where Kendra is, it's how she's processing everything. She describes things as wild and crazy, but there's very little detail beyond that. There's no extended discussion about the charges, no visible urgency about the situation itself. Instead, the focus shifts quickly to daily routines, logistics, and maintaining some level of normalcy. And that creates a contrast, because externally, the situation is escalating. Legal consequences, custody changes, public scrutiny. But internally, at least based on that call, the tone feels controlled, almost detached, which sets up what comes next. Because once you listen more closely to how both Kendra and Joseph are communicating in that call, the gap between what's happening and how they're reacting becomes much harder to ignore. When the focus shifts fully to the jail call itself, the tone becomes the most revealing part of the entire situation. The expectation going in is straightforward. A situation this serious would usually come with urgency, concern about the case, concern about the children, concern about what happens next. That's not what comes through. Instead, the conversation moves in a very different direction. Joseph Duggar talks about his environment inside the facility, how he's sleeping, what the conditions are like, how the lighting affects him at night. Kendra responds in a calm, steady way, asking basic questions and sharing updates about what she's doing. Then the conversation shifts again. They begin discussing the Bible, specific translations, whether Joseph prefers the New Living Translation over the King James Version. There's even a moment where Kendra jokes about him changing versions after he gets out. It's casual, almost routine, and that's where the tension starts to build. Because the context surrounding this call hasn't changed. The charges are still there. The custody situation is still unresolved. The legal process is still moving forward. Yet the conversation continues into everyday topics: food, health, even physical fitness. Joseph talks about trying to eat better and stay active. Kendra mentions struggling to eat, feeling weak, and trying to recover physically. They encourage each other. They reassure each other. But they rarely return to the core issue. And when they do reference what's happening, it's framed in a very specific way, as something they're being led through, something they'll come out stronger from, something tied to faith and personal growth. That framing matters because it doesn't align with the external reality of the situation. It reframes it. And once that becomes clear, the jail call stops feeling like a simple conversation and starts raising a much larger question about how this entire situation is being understood internally. That internal framing doesn't exist in isolation. It's reinforced by the environment around them. Throughout the call and in what follows outside of it, one thing becomes increasingly clear. Kendra Duggar is not handling this situation alone. She's surrounded by members of the Duggar family who are actively involved in day-to-day decisions. She references being with John Duggar and Abby, along with Jed Duggar. There are discussions about business responsibilities, coordination, and trying to manage what needs to be handled while Joseph is in custody. This isn't passive support, it's structured involvement. At the same time, other figures begin to surface. Joy Duggar and her husband Austin are mentioned as part of Kendra's extended support system. Anna Duggar, who has her own history tied to similar public controversy, is also reportedly reaching out, offering financial help and attempting to connect with Kendra. And then there's the broader context. Local law enforcement, including the Washington County Sheriff's Office, is reportedly present around family properties during this period. That adds another layer, not just internal coordination, but external attention. All of this points to something larger than a single case, because while Joseph Duggar is the one facing charges, the response involves a network. Family members stepping into roles, financial systems activating, and a shared way of interpreting what's happening. Even the language used in the call reflects that influence. Repeated references to faith, to being guided through hardship, to viewing the situation as something temporary and purposeful. Those ideas don't just appear spontaneously. They reflect a consistent framework that shapes how events are processed. And when that framework is supported by a tightly connected family structure, it becomes even more reinforced, which leads to a difficult question. If everyone involved is operating within the same system, financially, emotionally, and ideologically, then where does accountability actually come from? That question becomes even more important when you look at what's missing. Throughout everything, the bond hearing, the family response, the jail call, there's one perspective that remains almost entirely absent. The victim. There are references to legal restrictions, conditions set by the court, limitations placed on Joseph Duggar's contact with minors. But beyond that, there's very little acknowledgement of the person at the center of the case. Instead, the focus consistently returns to Joseph, to Kendra, and to the family around them. How they're coping, how they're adjusting, how they're moving forward. And that imbalance starts to stand out. Because while the legal process is still ongoing, the way a situation is discussed, what's emphasized, what's minimized, can shape how it's understood by everyone involved. In this case, the emphasis appears to be on stability, maintaining routines, keeping businesses running, supporting each other through what's described as a difficult period. At the same time, the conditions tied to Joseph's release introduce practical limitations. Restrictions around contact with minors could affect daily life, including church involvement, family interactions, and work responsibilities. Those limitations don't just exist on paper. They carry real implications for how this situation unfolds going forward. And when you combine that with the family's ability to adapt quickly, financially, logistically, and internally, It creates a scenario where two very different realities are unfolding at once. One shaped by the legal system, and the other shaped by the environment surrounding it. And those two realities don't always move in the same direction. What started as a simple update, Joseph Duggar being released on bond, turns out to be something much more layered once you look at everything around it. The release itself is only one part of the story. Kendra Duggar's situation, including the loss of custody and her reliance on others for information, adds a different level of complexity. At the same time, Jim Bob Duggar's role, financially and structurally, shows how quickly the family was able to respond once that bond was set. And then there's the jail call. Not just what was said, but how it was said. The tone, the focus, the way the situation is framed internally compared to how it appears externally. When you put all of that together, it starts to raise a broader question, not just about what happened, but about how it's being understood and handled by the people closest to it. Because if this is how things are unfolding at the beginning, what does that mean for what comes next? The legal process is still ongoing, the conditions are in place, and the situation is far from resolved. But the response so far gives a clearer picture of the system surrounding it and how that system operates under pressure. If you've been following this case, I'm interested in your perspective. What stood out to you the most? The release itself, the family's response, or what came out of that jail call? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to follow how this develops, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next update.